Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. As the European Commission unveils its most ambitious roadmap yet to end all Russian gas imports by 2027, the EU moves to fully sever its energy ties with Moscow. This decisive step has major implications for energy security, geopolitical strategy and member state unity. Joining us is Tomasz Włostowski, he's managing partner at EU Strategies, to explore what this roadmap means for the bloc's future internal cohesion and Europe's stance against Kremlin aggression. Tomasz, welcome back to TVP World, and thank you as always for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, sir. So before we kick off, there's a quote from Kaja Kallas, which I'd like to share with you, and then I'll get your view on it. She's EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and what she tweeted was, Europe has already drastically reduced its reliance on Russian energy. Today, we unveiled our plan to end all Russian energy imports by 2027. This will mark a permanent break. Russia will no longer be able to use energy as a weapon against us. Couple of words in that tweet which struck me. The first is 2027. Well, it's a number, of course. And the second was the word permanent. I'd like you to start with 2027. Is that long enough in which to completely cut off all Russian gas supplies to Europe?
Well, it's possible. I think it's possible. The real question is whether member states will really jump on board and sort of implement the plans that the Commission wants them to implement. Let's sort of break down what the Commission is proposing. So first of all, they're dividing up the severance of our relationship with Russian gas sort of into two steps. The first one is by 2025, right, and that's sort of the spot purchases and new contracts for gas. By 2027, we're supposed to finish importing gas under the existing long-term contracts. And of course, a lot of member states have already done that. There's just a number of member states that are still sort of dependent on the pipeline gas coming in from Russia. So, within 2 years, is it possible to replace them completely? I think it is. The only question is whether they will be willing to do so.
Okay, so that raises a third question, and that is the willingness of countries to do this. And again, there is the possibility, is there not, of some kind of disparity between countries' attitudes towards continuing to take Russian gas. You take Hungary, for example, or Slovakia, they come to mind. So is what Kaja Kallas said about it being permanent really reliable?
Well, look, I think it's an excellent question. A couple of points need to be made. I think the first one is, I think it's important to keep in mind that EU has actually reduced its reliance on Russian gas significantly. However, that severance, sort of that relationship on gas, it wasn't done because the EU decided to do so. Right? EU actually managed to get rid of Russian coal, and that was a European decision. We have also decided to get rid of Russian oil, which was also an EU decision. However, with respect to gas, the reason why we're not importing Russian gas is not because we decided not to do so, but it's really because the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, and earlier the Russians refused to supply the gas. So it's not that the EU decided to, wean itself of Russian gas. It had, I think, external help, so to speak, and I think that's very important to point out because once EU started implementing sanctions on oil and on coal, EU never really touched gas until very recently, and even the sanctions we did adopt on LNG, we were not able to adopt a ban on importation of LNG. The sanctions we adopted on LNG were very, very weak, and the reason for that, of course, is because there's just lack of willingness of member states to completely sever that relationship. That's number one. Number two, there's a concern of of the effect that getting rid of Russian gas in Europe will have on gas prices in Europe, right? I mean, I think most players in the energy market and most politicians are aware, and the Commission has made that point today as well, that look, we can replace Russian gas. It's not a big issue. There's just so much LNG coming in, and there will be much more coming in, that we can get rid of Russian LNG if we want to. The real question is its impact on the energy prices and gas prices in Europe.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the price differential. Whether we get LNG from, I don't know, the US, from Norway, and the gas that we get from Russia. How different are they in price, and what effect will that have economically?
Well, look, obviously, there is a reason why Europe has been so reliant on the Russian pipeline gas, and that's because it was just extremely, extremely cheap. And there's no way of avoiding that issue. Russian gas was really, really cheap. With a caveat, of course, it was cheap for some, it wasn't cheap for everybody, because that was the main point, and that was the main reason why Russian gas was sort of unreliable, at least in our part of Europe, was because Russians, through the sort of monopolistic practices of Gazprom, they were able to differentiate the prices. So the prices going into Western Europe were quite very, very low, whereas the prices going into, let's say, recalcitrant Central European member states were much, much higher. Of course, the Russians justified it by differences in the volumes, but there was also a political element, of course, at play. And of course, LNG is much more expensive. It's much more expensive because it's coming from far away. It needs to be, liquefied, and it needs to be decompressed when it arrives. So we need to roll out the infrastructure, which a lot of member states are doing. So the LNG that's coming in is much more expensive to get to Europe than the pipeline gas, which is already the pipeline is already there. Even we don't fully understand, or we don't fully know the extent of damage to the Nord Stream pipelines, but there are rumors that some of them can be revamped and sort of reestablished, but the political will to bring that pipeline Russian gas is not there, and for some time it's not going to be there. But it's just that possibility of that really, really cheap gas being available, it's always a temptation. So going to your question of how reliable is is the promise that this is a permanent severance of the gas relationship with Russia, I think the doubt in your voice was well justified.
Okay. So now, whatever happens in the future, maybe this process will be reversed. We shall see. But in the meantime, what happens to the energy mix in Europe? Do you anticipate other sources of energy, for example, nuclear, taking the place of the gas that is no longer being supplied from Russia and which is too expensive to supply using LNG?
Well, look, we have a couple of things at play, right? So, let's keep in mind that, gas is used for a number of things, right? Some of the things, it's just production of energy. And that's where, the Repower EU's plan from 2022 to roll out renewables in Europe is coming in, and it's quite successful. The current target is 45%. It's the indicative target for Europe. So renewables are coming in, and they are coming in everywhere. They're coming in Poland as well. They're coming in countries that don't have particularly good conditions for it. But that revolution is underway, and that's not going to be stopped. So obviously, the consumption of gas for the energy sector is going to be decreasing just because renewables are coming in, and let's hope that the rollout of nuclear plants in Poland and in some of the other member states will also materialize in the more distant future. So that's number one. But number two, we also have the sort of hard to abate sectors for whom gas is a feedstock for production, mainly the chemical industry, fertilizers, and so on. So there are still a number of chemical sectors and other sectors that will be still using gas in the future. However, the EU has made that decision, and I think I think we can trust that tendency in that direction is going to be maintained, basically to reduce our reliance and our use of fossil fuels, and that's going to continue. So, the overall demand of gas, especially for energy in Europe, is going to be falling in the midterm. And in the meanwhile, and the Commission actually admits this, that we will be using gas for some time, but in the long term, it's going to be decreasing. It's going to change the application. We're going to move away from energy more into the feedstock and the chemical sector. The next point that the Commission is making, that there is going to be an oversupply of LNG. There are a lot of countries that still have gas and are eager to exploit it while we can, because hopefully the world is going to be moving away from using gas. So the idea is that the countries that actually have it are quite eager to sell it to us, because we will be needing it and we will have an oversupply, so the prices are going to fall.
Okay, right. So that's fairly clear from the European perspective. What about the Russian side? What do you think their response is going to be? I mean, it's clearly a buyer's market, and that'll become even more clear. Russia's prices that it's selling to India and China for have been substantially reduced. Where does that leave Russia, and what can it do in retaliation, if anything?
Well, in terms of retaliation, I don't think there's much they can do. It's just because, again, the way this whole thing started is the Russians withheld the gas. I mean, that was the first move they did when they were building up to their invasion of Ukraine. That caused the energy crisis in Europe. And I think in the long term, that was just tactically and strategically a stupid move, and it cost them a very lucrative, very stable market. So that was a bad move with the benefit of the hindsight. However, what can they do? Well, number one is, as we've already discussed, gas is a feedstock for the chemical industry, and that's something the Russians have been quite eager to exploit. So they are going to redirect that gas into their chemical fertilizer sector, of which they're a major global producer. And they've been using that, first of all, to fix their revenues, and number two, to build some political influence all over the world with their chemical, and in particular the fertilizer supply to the global south. So that's number one. And then number two, of course, there will be eager buyers of Russian gas in Asia. China, India, and some of the other countries are quite eager to buy that gas. Of course, if Russia can sell it to us, that means it's a buyer's market, and they can get very favorable pricing on it.
Right. Okay. So, how's this being taken in Ukraine? Clearly, they are glad that Russia's war chests aren't being filled by Europe. But what's the Ukrainian energy situation in the absence of Russian gas?
Well, for Ukrainians, I think this is something they've been quite sort of keen on and eager. I mean, let's remember that one of the reasons why the European consumption of gas is dropping in 2025 is because the Ukrainians were just unwilling to extend the Ukrainian gas transit, and that's what caused the big commotion with Hungary and Slovakia. So, Ukraine right now has, its major objective is to win the war. And everything that will help them win the war is welcomed by Ukrainians. And of course, the massive revenues that are coming into Russia, both from their gas sales to Europe, but also, from oil sales all over the world. I mean, the Ukrainians are very, very keen and very active in trying to get the world away from Russian energy. So there's no doubt about it. This is a major success story for Kyiv.
A major coup for Ukraine. Tomasz Włostowski, thank you very much indeed, as always, for sharing your excellent analysis with our audience. Have a good evening, sir.
You too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.